Hello, everybody. So, my name is Rasyiqah Binti Abdul Halim, and for today's podcast title is called Listening to the Silence and Eco-Critical Reading of Wicked. Yes, so welcome. So, today, most people know it's a fantasy musical, right? Wicked, maybe even just a story about good versus evil. But if we slow down and really pay attention, Wicked is also a story about nature, power, and what happens when certain voices are deliberately silenced. So, Wicked originally began as a novel, not many people know about this, written by Gregory Maguire in 1995, is a revisionist retelling of The Wizard of Oz, which means it takes a familiar story and tells it in a different perspective. I like to think of it this way. It's like a fan fiction. So since then it has been adapted into a Broadway musical and most recently a film. So Wicked was one of the musicals that I really enjoyed watching and listening to. The soundtrack, I mean, and um, was one of the reason why I became a musical theater kid myself. So for this podcast, I'm treating Wicked as a narrative text, one that reflects cultural and environmental anxieties rather than just a fantasy entertainment. So, what makes Wicked especially interesting from an eco critical point of view is its portrayal of animals. So, non human beings who can speak, think, and participate in society. Um, so, over time, these animals are gradually silenced and pushed out. So, in this podcast, I will be focusing on three main ideas. So, number one is how the oppression of animals represent ecological injustice, and then how political power is used to control nature, and how Alphaba can be read as a figure of ecological resistance. And I'll also connect Wicked to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and to real world environmental issues. So before getting into the text itself, it's important to know what eco-criticism is because I too sometimes confuse myself, I have to admit. So simply put, eco-criticism looks at how stories represent nature and how they shape the way humans think about their relationship with the environment. So it asks questions like who speaks for nature, who benefits from environmental decisions, and whose lives are treated as expendable. So, one key idea in eco criticism is anthropocentrism. And what is that? So, it's the belief that humans are more important than all other forms of life. So, from an eco critical perspective, we can expose how anthropocentric systems normalize the domination and silencing of non human life. So when a society operates this way, nature is often reduced to a resource, something to be controlled or exploited rather than respected. So in Wicked, this anthropocentric mindset becomes very clear through the treatment of animals. At the beginning of the story, actually, animals were respected members of society. They were allowed to teach at universities, they were allowed to speak publicly, and they lived alongside humans as equals. So there was a sense of balance between human and non human life. But when the narrative progresses, this balance just slowly disappeared. You see, animals now are silenced, they are imprisoned, and they turn into spectacles or threats. So, what is striking is that environmental injustice in Wicked doesn't begin with open violence, but with bureaucracy, laws, education systems, and the quiet removal of voice. So, what makes this especially disturbing is how gradual the process is. So, there is no single moment where just everything just poof disappeared. Instead, the rights were taken away step by step, making the oppression seem normal over time. So, from an eco critical perspective, this mirrors how environmental destruction often happens in the real world. Ecosystems are not destroyed overnight. Instead, small decisions like cutting one forest, relocating one community, slowly accumulate until the damage becomes irreversible. So the wizard's regime plays a crucial role in this process. by the wizard, I mean the Wizard of Oz himself. So the government uses fear and propaganda to justify the control of animals. And by framing animals as dangerous or disruptive, the state creates public support for their oppression. So this reflects how environmental control is often disguised as protection, progress, or security. And this is where Wicked strongly critiques anthropocentrism. Animals are no longer valued for who they are, but judged based on how useful they appear to humans. Nature becomes something to be managed rather than lived with at this point. So, this logic closely resembles real world attitudes towards development, wildlife management, and industrial expansion. So, another important element in Wicked is the way resistance is treated. Characters who defend animals are punished, erased, or forced into hiding. So, environmental concern is framed as dangerous or radical at this point. From an eco critical perspective, this shows how ethical responsibility toward nature often, often clashes with systems of power. So, Elphaba, the witch, is central to this ecological reading. She consistently recognizes animals as equals and refuses to accept their oppression. And because of this, right, she is labeled wicked. Okay, so her green skin, if you don't know, Alphaba has green skin, marks her as different and, however, symbolically aligns her with nature itself. So, from an eco-critical point of view, Alphaba represents ecological conscience, the voice that insists something is wrong even when society refuses to listen. So, moving on to the comparative and contextual reflection. The environmental concerns in Wicked don't exist in isolation. They connect closely to texts like the most recent one I read was Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So Carson's work exposed the harmful effects of pesticides on the ecosystem, especially on birds who quite literally lose their voices in the text. So nature in Carson's work cannot speak for itself and must be represented by those willing to listen. This parallels the animals in Wicked. You see, just like the birds in Silent Spring, the animals are silent not because they are incapable, but because their voices are inconvenient. So both texts reveal how environmental harm is often hidden or justified until it becomes impossible to ignore. So there is also strong similarity between Carson and Elphaba as figures of resistance. So Carson was criticized and attacked for challenging powerful industries. So was Elphaba. She experienced a similar fate and she refuses to comply with the wizard's policies. So in both cases, right, environmental advocacy is portrayed as dangerous precisely because it threatens established power structures. So beyond literary comparison, Wicked also reflects contemporary environmental issues. For example, indigenous communities. They are frequently excluded from decisions about land use despite having deep ecological knowledge. So environmental activists today are often labeled as extremists or opposing for exposing sorry, not exposing for opposing deforestation, um, pollution or unsustainable development, right? So Wicked helps us recognize how patterns of silencing and marginalization continue to repeat themselves in environmental debates. Sorry. So, to conclude, Wicked offers much more than a fantasy retelling. When read through an eco-critical lens, it becomes a powerful story about um, environmental injustice, power, and responsibility. The silencing of animals exposes the consequences of anthropocentric thinking, while alpha bus resistance highlights the importance of ethical care toward the more than human world. So by connecting Wicked to thinkers like Rachel Carson and to contemporary environmental issues, we can see how literature and narrative help us make sense of ecological crisis. So ultimately, Wicked reminds us that environmental harm often becomes visible only after resistance has already been dismissed as dangerous, or in this case, wicked. See what I did there? So, in a time of climate crisis and environmental uncertainty, that question feels more relevant than ever today. So that's all for me. I really had fun analyzing my favorite musical with um, this subject. Yeah, I really had fun doing it because as a theater kid myself, um, I it's the only right thing for me to do. So yeah, thank you for listening. I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.